This is a United States nickel, and I'm going to turn this and a bunch of others into a knife. Welcome back to the studio. The journey begins by drawing an idea down on paper. I decided to try to make a K-bar. Now I've seen people make K-bars before, but never one quite like this. Once I have it drawn, I then cut it out so I can trace it onto a piece of wood. Then I can use that to cut the profile of the blade. Now a blacksmith will hammer and forge a blade into a shape, but I'm not a blacksmith, I'm a bronzesmith. So for me, I have to make a pattern, and then I can use that to cast my blank out of molten metal. I cut it out pretty rough and then use my sander to get closer to the finishing lines. Places where the sander doesn't quite reach, I'll just use a file. It's balsa wood, so it's pretty easy going. So we got our basic pattern made, but before I get too far on this, I need to make sure I can actually melt nickels, because I've never done that before. Now the composition of a nickel is 25% metallic nickel and 75% copper. The melting point of nickel is 2,651 degrees Fahrenheit. The melting point of copper is 1,984 degrees Fahrenheit. So the melting point of the coin is somewhere in between, but that's pushing the limits of my furnace. Maxed out, the highest reading I could get was just under 2350, and that's not quite enough. So it almost melted, kind of welded together into a blob, and you can see it's kind of all continuous in there, but it's not actually fluid metal. Useless for pouring. So I'm going to try one more thing, see if I can get it a little hotter. Now this is the first furnace I ever made. It has a port on this side and this side, so I can have two burners going at the same time. Hopefully that'll get it hot enough to turn those nickels into fluid metal. This furnace got just a little bit hotter at around 24 to 2500 degrees. And thankfully, it was just hot enough to get it to flow. So yes, we can melt nickels into liquid metal. When you cut it open, it looks pretty good. It's the same color as the nickel. So the next question is, can we actually cast it and form a knife blade? I have no idea, but I sure want to find out. Now it seems like a distinguishing feature of the K-bar is a fuller running along the top of the blade. I have no idea how to do that, but worst thing that'll happen is I'll fail and I'll do it again. So let's figure it out. So I used my bench vise to hold my Dremel in place and made a makeshift jig that would hold the blade in a position so I could use the Dremel to carve out the fuller. And this actually worked pretty well. I stacked some nickels on it to see about how many coins I'm going to need, and it looks like about 2 rolls worth. I embed the blade in a special oil-based sand that I was made for casting. Now the name of the game for this piece is going to be get the metal in fast, because I know that metal's going to freeze fast when I pour it. Because this will be a vertical pour, I'm going to have to screw 2 wooden plates to the side to keep the sand from bulging out when I pour. Not that there's going to be a lot of hydrostatic pressure in this, but it's just good practice. So the way I have this set up, it's going to be a vertical pour and the metal's going to go straight down. That's not ideal because it creates a lot of turbulence and can get gas bubbles and stuff stuck in the metal, but I know this is going to freeze so fast. This is the fastest way I think I can get the metal in there to hopefully fill it. It's going to be rough, but once we have our blank, I can work with that. So in go the nickels, and back into the furnace they go. Now I know some of you are probably thinking, hey, that's illegal. Shh, we'll just keep it between you and me. It'll be our little secret. Jokes aside, it's actually not illegal to do this. As long as I'm not melting mass quantities for profit and doing it just for educational or novelty purposes, it's perfectly fine. And this is definitely not profitable. So that actually turned out pretty well. A little bit of flashing to grind off, but we have our nickel knife blank. Now it's time to start filing and grinding. I have a very small and low-powered 1x30-inch belt sander. It does the job, barely, but still, it does the job. So this piece of nickel copper that I just cut off is actually worth more this way than as a coin. That means when you take the metal and stamp the United States signature on it, it actually loses value because of inflation. It just seems like that's not the way things are supposed to be.
That's all I have to say about that.
Now the fuller needed to be cleaned up a little bit, and I thought I might be able to freehand it with the Dremel. My hands aren't nearly steady enough, and I realized pretty quick that was a bad idea. I tried files and sandpaper, but that didn't really cut it. So I figured I need to set the jig back up and just redo it that way. So I got the fuller ground in there, and I think it looks alright. Maybe not Alex steel quality, but it'll do. There's a few casting flaws that run a little too deep for me to get out entirely, but for the most part the blade is pretty clean. So at this point I'm going to start grinding in the bevel. The bevels are tricky and slow going. I'm not sure how professionals do it, but I just eyeball it and do my best to get it close. But that blade gets pretty hot, so I'll routinely dunk it in water to cool it down. I made a homemade file guide so I can try to fit up the guard as flush as I can to the blade. Now for the guard, I'm going to recycle a failed blade from the Bowie knife challenge. If you remember, this was an aluminum bronze blade and it cracked, so I had to start over. But there's still some sections that are usable, I think. I'm gonna do my best to find the center, and I have to get a slot in there so I can slide it over the tang of the blade. By marking the center, I can drill holes with my drill press and then file those out to get the slot. It's another fairly slow process. Every time I do something like this, I'm more appreciative of the precision of a good bladesmith. It just amazes me how perfect some of the blades you see are. I was a little off center, so I'm going to mark it and sand that down so it looks a little bit better. So it's starting to take shape. The guard fits up pretty well. It's not perfect. It's a little gappage. Might work on it a little more. Now I need to start thinking about the handle. Now it's my understanding that the K-bar is made of stacked leather with a pommel on the end. So I think what I need to do is start stacking leather fitted to the tang and then figure out what to do for the pommel. So I cut a bunch of squares out of a piece of leather. And then carved a hole in there with a chisel. So the leather's all stacked. Now I gotta glue it together and make a solid handle. I need a way to attach the pommel to the back of the blade, so I drilled a small hole into the tang and threaded it. That way I can screw in a threaded rod, and that will hold the pommel on so I can screw it in nice and tight. I screwed on some nuts before cutting it to size. That way when I screw them back off, it cleans off any metal burrs left behind. For the pommel, I thought what better to put on a nickel knife than a nickel. I glued several of them together, and the idea is to tap a hole directly in center and thread it, and then I can screw it onto the end of the blade. Now it's time to glue things on, so I coat the blade in masking tape to help keep it from getting covered in glue. I coat the tang in a thick layer of Vaseline so I can take the handle off when it's hardened and shape it away from the blade. I'm using a 2-part epoxy. This is a kind of epoxy used for tabletops, and I'm hoping it works for this. It was that or a 5-minute epoxy, and I knew this was going to take me longer than 5 minutes. So I put a whole bunch of Vaseline on there. It's all epoxy together, and I'm just hoping I can get this off, but it's all cured. I thought it might be easier to take off while the epoxy still had a little give. So while it was still tacky, I decided to try to slide that blade off. It was a little tricky. By putting it in my bench vise, I was able to force the handle to start coming off. So I was able to get it off while it's still a little tacky. Now I'm going to put it somewhere safe so it doesn't get misshapen while it finishes curing. That cured to be rock hard, so now it's time to shape the handle. I had to use a file to open up that hole to fit around the tang a little bit better. It was a little too tight to fit back on. Then I took it to my sander to help shape it, but this epoxy proved to be a nightmare to sand through. It gummed everything up and wouldn't work, so I used angle grinders, different sanders. Eventually I used a diamond cutting wheel to get through that layer of epoxy and start shaping it. Once I got through the layer of epoxy and down to the leather, it became a lot easier to sand. I'll screw on my nickel pommel and finish shaping the butt. And now that everything's shaped, I want to glue it all together so it's nice and solid. I used some dyed mineral oil to try to give the handle some color. Probably not the best for the job, but it's what I had, so. There you go, a nickel K-bar. You bladesmiths can critique everything you just saw me do. I'm not much of a bladesmith, but it's fun to try. And this was a cool experiment. This knife's made of nickels. I've never seen anyone do that before. Is it super sharp? It's kind of sharp, not super sharp. Come on, it's a knife made of nickels. It's a novelty knife, just for fun. Anyway, thanks for coming along and watching me make that. Don't forget to check out some of my other videos and come on back for the next project. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.